Artois 1916. The only relief, continued. Magnicourt, Conteville, Incourt, Guigny. Derisive whistles were heard, directed at our commanding officer. This sub-lieutenant wasn't a bad fellow, but too meticulous, a stickler about everything, and he didn't have the sympathy of his men. This was a good opportunity, or a bad one, depending on your viewpoint, for this to be made known. Scattered in the darkness, concealed by the thickly falling snow, just try to find out who is whistling. The soldier who is certain of impunity sometimes can become unjust and cruel. Of course, mistakes can happen. Anyone can miss a turn in the road when the snow is swirling around, blinding you, and obscuring the road ahead and its borders. And nobody else noticed that we had taken a wrong turn. In general, I have a strong aversion against those who wear gold stripes, who display a bit of authority, of despotism, of the militarism which had us all in its sharp claws. But this time I didn't at all approve of the attitude of my comrades, because they didn't stop at whistling. They hurled all kinds of the rudest imaginable insults upon this officer. Others called out to him, "Go learn to read a map, to the schoolhouse. Do you need a lantern to show you how to get there? You don't deserve to wear those stripes, you should give them up." The officer didn't say a word, and after being shown the road to Bethonsart by the railway employee, he gave the order to head out. Those followed who wanted to, or who could. I don't know how I found the strength to get to this village. The human body sometimes seems to be an inexhaustible source of energy, even if it means that legs, loins, and haunches demand an accounting later on, and remind us with sharp pains what excesses had been asked of them. When we arrived, we were counting on a quarter-litre of just coffee. We'd been promised it, but the field kitchens hadn't arrived yet. In a big shed, they had spread out a little straw. I collapsed in a corner and rolled up in my blanket, slept like a log. It was 6 in the morning. Since 9 o'clock the night before, we'd been marching, covering 30 kilometres in frightful weather and roads. In my company, only about 30 of us had arrived together. The others straggled in during the course of the day. At noon, someone shook me awake to eat a bit of soup, but then I fell asleep again. My nerves were unwound, and I was like a marionette with broken strings. I couldn't even stand up. The next day my feet felt a little less painful, and I summoned the strength to go to Menenval to find my pack, still in the care of my former company, which was then billeted in this village. I took advantage of this opportunity to find out the reason for the punishment which the captain had inflicted on me. I expected to read a masterpiece of literature. After all, he had a law degree, and had held a staff post at the ministry. The sergeant major agreed to show me the register of punishments, and I read, "Barthus, class of, etc., charged with carrying out an order," he said to his men, "just look like you're working." That seemed stupid to me. Neither fish nor fowl, as they say. Surely Colonel Douce must have been curious for other explanations for my being broken in rank. But then colonels aren't expected to have dealings with corporals. That might risk diminishing their standing. I was just about to slam shut this libelous book where my name was forever inscribed for indiscipline, when I noticed that the charge was accompanied by the following amendments, signed by Commandant Leblanc. This corporal sets a bad example. He is unfit to serve as a non-com. There are a good number of candidates in his company who could replace him, to good effect. In consequence, I have the honour, Colonel, to ask you to reduce him in rank. These lines wounded and infuriated me. Take away my stripes because I lack military spirit. For my socialist and anti-militarist opinions, so be it. For me, that would be a badge of honour, just like the Croix de Guerre is for others. It would be evidence of fidelity to my principles, in a time when so many had denied theirs. But the words setting a bad example were just too much. I immediately decided to file a protest with the colonel. But then I reflected that my poor stripes were hardly worth the trouble of stirring up a fuss, screwing up the whole hierarchical structure. And further, wouldn't it be satisfying for those who had taken them from me to see how hurt I was by losing them? But in the 13th Company, all my comrades begged me to protest, to give a humiliating lesson to the captain. Corporals offered to turn in their stripes in an act of protest. Deeply moved, I dissuaded them from doing this. Finally, when I left for Bethonsart, all hands were stretched out to me, and I saw tears welling up in the eyes of comrades, some of whom were with me since Montlouis. All these promises of support truly touched me, and this fortified me to resolve to ask for a hearing with Colonel Douce. From victim, I would turn accuser against Captain Cross for having forced men to work in a trench exposed to machine gun fire, without it being absolutely necessary. I had to postpone my request for a hearing. The regiment was dispersed, the colonel was still at the front lines, not at an outpost, and finally we were pulling up stakes and shifting back and forth to make room for the English. On March 8th, in lousy weather always threatening to snow, we left Betonsart and went to encamp at Magnicourt. The course was a short one, only 7 kilometres, but very hard, since everybody's feet were more or less afflicted by the cold. The next day, twice the distance to cover, and twice the suffering. The regiment encamped at Conteville. That evening I took a little walk by myself. I noticed, at the end of an empty courtyard, a little house with doors and windows wide open. I boldly entered this seemingly abandoned lodging. The ground floor consisted of a single darkened room. At first I couldn't see anything, but once my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, I was not a little surprised to see a human body stretched out on the ground, covered with such miserable rags that it left parts of the body naked. I quickly approached the body, and once I touched it I realized that it was a plaster statue dressed in beggar's cloths. Then I saw a door leading to a small chapel, and an inscription above told me that I was the guest of St. Benedict, and that this hovel was where he had lived and died in piety, zeal, and penitence. One was invited to send a wish or a prayer to this influential saint, which would surely be answered. I wanted to ask that all the cannon, rifles, and other murderous devices be hurled into hell, but I thought it would be useless. St. Benedict wouldn't have done that, no matter how highly placed he was at the Lord's right hand. It's curious how often you come upon shrines to saints in the Pas-de-Calais. One would think that a good portion of the inhabitants of paradise came from this very department. The next day we had to get back on the road and scratch out 23 kilometres this time to get to Incourt. We arrived there hobbling along, leaning on sturdy sticks like a bunch of old men. I call upon those who have taken a walk with a simple blister on the heel or the ankle to think about our suffering, with feet that were nothing but one whole blister, or even worse, one whole chilblain. The name Incourt seemed to mean that it was unshort, and indeed the houses of this village stretched for almost 2 kilometres along the road. It was a big disappointment to think that we had only a few more steps to reach our encampment, and instead it took a half-hour to get to it, at the farthest point in the village. The next day, again on the road. We wondered what our goal was, where we were going, but in vain because no one told us anything. That day we encamped at Guigny. This village was so little that some sections, mine included, couldn't find any room in it, and we had to use our own tent cloths for shelter, which wasn't too comfortable. In the night, the cold chased us out from under them. As for me, I sought out a little space in a stable, where I slept like a blessed soul, despite the risk of catching a few kicks from the cows who were sleeping there. Finally, March 12th was supposed to be our last day of marching, but they told us that it would be a long and hard one, so they took 2 packs away from each squad. That way, after each rest break, by turns, 2 soldiers in each squad could march without carrying anything. 1916. Artois, Picardy, Crécy, Le Titre, La Motte-Bulleux, Favières, Le Crotoy. Along the way we passed through Crécy and the famous battlefield, an episode of the 100 Years' War. Just one monument placed in the town square of Crécy reminded the passer-by of this historical fact. Today this would only be a minor skirmish, a raid, compared to the titanic battles of the current war. After the battlefield we had to cross an interminable forest. Who knows if these centuries-old oak trees hadn't been witnesses to the precipitous flight of the King of France and his companions? Finally, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, our battalion arrived at its cantonment in the village of Le Titre. But 3 days later they moved us to the neighbouring village of La Motte-Bulleux. The squad I was in was lucky enough to be lodged with sturdy farm folk who also ran a roadside tavern, where the tables and chairs were at our disposal for taking our meals. In the barn, a soft bed of fresh straw was heavenly for us. Of course, the drills began right away, and no doubt at the orders of our commandant they became long and intensive. One day we were surprised at our exercises by the unexpected arrival of Colonel Douce. Lieutenant Groulois, nicknamed Gueule de Bois, Wooden Mug, who commanded our company, obsequiously rushed up to the big boss. "How many hours of drilling are these men doing?" asked the colonel. 8 hours, replied Lieutenant Groulois, afraid that it wouldn't be enough, with 10 minutes rest each hour. 8 hours, exclaimed the colonel. I would be completely wiped out after that. Lieutenant, less drilling and more rest. And he disappeared. After this visit, our rest breaks were 10 minutes longer. That was 10 minutes less of getting wiped out, as the colonel had said. One night I was yanked out of a deep sleep by the noise of the door opening, and here was our landlord, lantern in hand, who approached us. "What's going on?" I asked him. "I need 2 of you to give me a hand." "Right away," I said as I got up and shook my neighbour awake. If he wasn't already a priest, my neighbour was training to be one. Steeped in devotion, he had little to do with us except the most strictly indispensable relations and conversations. He spent his free time in the company of the battalion's curates, monks and seminarians. Galen was his name. But what was this peaceable duty we were recruited for? There was no enemy outpost around here to be raided. It was simply to lend a hand to a cow who was having a hard time calving. Modestly I confessed my inexperience in these matters. The Abbé Galen's inexperience was no less than my own, but as a true disciple of Christ, he couldn't refuse to help his fellow man. Besides, our landlord assured us that our role couldn't be easier and required no serious apprenticeship. As if he knew the dismal fate which awaited him in this world, the little veal calf had gotten his rear legs and his hindquarters out, but he obstinately refused to get the rest out. That's what we had to get him to do. The farmer tied a rope to the legs of the newborn. Galen and I were asked to pull on the rope while the farmer took care of the cow, but we had to act with care and a certain dexterity, which we lacked completely, in order to coordinate our efforts with the mother's contractions. We had to work with nature and not force it or abuse it. But you don't become a midwife of cattle in just a day. Despite our best intentions, we must have pulled too hard, because once the horned baby finally got his nose out, he seemed to be in miserable shape. In vain they gave him a swig of hot rum and a brisk rub-down. Then they rolled him in a basket of straw as soft as a duvet. But nothing did any good. The little calf died right away. These good folks wanted to thank us nonetheless for our troubles, and they invited us to drink a bowl of mulled wine. I accepted with pleasure, but Galen refused. Thinking that he didn't like wine, they offered him a little glass of excellent rum, but he refused it quite obstinately. These people were dumbfounded. For a poilu to refuse a glass of wine was extraordinary enough, but to turn down a glass of rum, that went beyond anything a Picard could imagine. But once Galen had left, I explained that, he being a priest, and the next day being Sunday, the day of communion, he couldn't risk his soul's salvation by swallowing even a drop of water, midnight having been rung a few moments before. The farmers were astounded to learn that they had recruited a clergyman to help their cow to give birth. They felt a vague remorse at having tempted a minister of God and placing him at risk of mortal sin. One evening, while we were eating our supper in the main room of the tavern, our section chief pushed the door open and told us, in few words, to be ready for departure at 6 the next morning. The officer could have waited until the end of our meal, because the news threw us into such a troubled state that we could hardly touch the heaping platter of beans which, just a moment before, we were all set to devour. We knew that at Verdun it would be nothing like this. We were even surprised that they gave us that much time to rest up. Home leaves were completely suspended from the time we left Saint-Éloi. 2 kilometres beyond La Motte-Bulleur, the road forked. One way led to Noyelles-sur-Mer, our point of embarkation. The other way led to the plains of Ponthieu, region of Picardy. Principal town is Abbeville. That will explain the efforts we made the next day to see which direction the head of the column would take. We let out a big sigh of relief when we saw that the vanguard turned its back on Noyelles. That meant we weren't leaving for Verdun, the very name of which froze us with dread. Any other destination did not matter to us, and immediately joy and gaiety spread through the ranks in the form of songs, laughter, jokes, and lively conversation. The whole division was on the move. It was assembled in an immense field for a big rest break, because the march was long and hard. Then the regiments and battalions dispersed to their respective cantonments. We were on the shores of the English Channel, near the mouth of the Somme. Our battalion was billeted at Favières, 2 kilometres from Le Crotoy, where I made my way the next day, a Sunday. Le Crotoy is a pleasant seaside resort right at the mouth of the Somme. One regiment of the division was billeted there. At low tide, hundreds of soldiers went fishing for shellfish and shrimps in the sand of the beach. The little town was quite lively. The next day, to exercise our legs, we carried out a long march by roue along the sand dunes of the seacoast. And then the next day, April 3rd, we once again took the road for La Motte-Bulleux. What had we come to Favières for? It certainly wasn't to breathe the restorative air of the Channel for 3 days. But we didn't waste any time trying to solve the mystery of this strategic manoeuvre. To tell the truth, we weren't unhappy to be returning to La Motte-Bulleux, which we reached at around 2 in the afternoon. That day we had an oppressive heat, coming right after some rather cold temperatures, and we hadn't left Favières until 8 in the morning, which meant that we endured the strongest heat of the day. At the last rest breaks, in the shade of each and every tree, you'd see a laggard lying, out of breath, dripping sweat. There were 100 of them from each battalion. Once we arrived, they asked for a list by company of the men who weren't able to keep up. It was, so they said, to put together a category of slackers, of men who had to be watched. Some clever ones detected an advantage to being put on this list. Who knows? Maybe you'd be exempt from carrying a pack in the next march, or maybe you'd be sent back to the divisional depot for a rest. I knew some who were left off the list, and others who hadn't fallen by the wayside, but who got their names on the list all the same. But the next day, at assembly, here is what they read out to us. The men who couldn't keep up with the column yesterday evidently need more training. As a consequence, until further notice, they will go to drills in campaign gear, with full packs. The others won't have to carry their packs. And that's how, for once, the tricksters got themselves tricked. The long sojourn we had in this village was such that a great intimacy built up between the poilus and the inhabitants, especially among the ladies. Some idyls were kindled. There were some amorous adventures which became tied and untied. As for me, a loving and faithful husband, I won the affections of a lady of La Motte, but alas, for her and for me. The snows of 65 winters had coloured her hair, and this lady was a poor old hag living with her husband in a shack at the far end of the village. The husband, worn down by the years and by rheumatism, lay moaning in his bed. His wife used up her last reserves of strength, making sure that her bits of field didn't go fallow, as well as a rather large garden surrounding the thatched cottage, 3/4 of which were choked with thistles and other weeds. I observed all this one day, when I was on my way to guard duty at the village's exit points, this useless and ridiculous guard duty, which they had set up according to established practice. Except on Sundays, this guard duty was a sort of relief for the poilus. In exchange, you could cut out 24 hours of drills or parades. Only the 4 hours of night duty you'd pull could perhaps be wearisome for those who couldn't appreciate the charm of solitude, of nocturnal silence, of contemplation of a starry sky, etc. It's true that at this time, stinging April showers often troubled the poetic moonlit vigils. Then you would seek refuge in the clever little sentry boxes which the wicker workers had fashioned out of the boughs of the Crécy forest. But if the downpour lasted, you'd be chased out by the raindrops and find better shelter behind a wall. It was during one of my breaks between guard duty shifts that I picked up a tool and went to working, spading the old lady's garden. "But, monsieur," said the old lady, "you're working for nothing. I'm too poor to pay you anything." "Don't worry about that, Grandma. I'll stop by every day when I'm off duty, until your garden is in good shape and your potatoes are planted," which she despaired about getting done in time. In fact, 4 or 5 days later, the work was done. The old lady didn't know how to express her thanks. She picked out for me the best apples in her cupboard, and I had to accept a coffee one evening. The old man wanted to be at the party too, so we took our coffee in the sick room. As coquettish as any daughter of Eve, the old lady showed me her portrait at age 20, and the old codger smiled impishly, as if to say, "You see, we were young once, and we were carefree in those days." And I had to listen to the tales of their young love. They were about to be married when the war broke out, the war of 1870, that is. He went off in the Garde Mobile. Once peace was signed, he hurried back to La Motte to find his fiancée, but the Prussians were still occupying the region and the village. The marriage was put off. From morning to evening he was at her house, attending to her every need. One day they were having a cosy tête-à-tête at home, which they hardly ever left, when a rude and insolent interofficier, probably unterofficier corporal, burst in. He claimed that he needed some information, but his true purpose was to harass the lovers. He went so far as to try to kiss the young woman right in front of her fiancé. Evoking these distant memories, the old lady turned red with indignation, as if she could still feel the lips of the Boche. But the story isn't finished. The young man, now an old codger nailed to his bed, had to defend the honour of his Picard blood, and to avenge the outrage he slapped the German on both cheeks. The non-com dashed out more quickly than he had come in, but he came back a moment later with a squad of policemen who seized the unlucky fiancé and dragged him off to jail, under a rain of blows and kicks. The cantonment's commander was a captain who inspired real terror among the inhabitants for his severity, his brutal discipline. He decided to set an example, to make it known that whoever dared to raise a hand against a German non-com would be shot the very next day. He had no idea of the circumstances which brought on this incident, but luckily for our pair of young lovers, he was billeted at the home of the town's mayor, who told him the whole story. The terrifying officer summoned the young girl, the heroine of the story, to his office. She presented herself, fearful and faltering. There also appeared the ungallant non-com, who was forced to confess his misdeeds. The next day they released the young Frenchman who was expecting to be shot. 3 days later the village was delivered from German occupation, and our two young folks got married, loved each other and had many children, now either dead or living far away. And they remained there, at home in the poor thatched cottage, from which only death would take them away. I took advantage of our stay in La Motte to try to see the colonel about my punishment. I submitted my request for a hearing at my company's office. I waited patiently for a week, and I made the request again. The next day, Commandant Leblanc had me summoned and received me in a very ungracious manner. "Why do you want to talk to the colonel?" he asked. "Commandant, sir, it's about my punishment. You know full well that if Captain Cross has punished you, he had good reason to do so." "That's not my opinion." "So you are persisting in your intention to protest this matter?" "Yes, Commandant, sir." "You know I won't support your request for a hearing." "Commandant, I'm sorry, but I will persist all the same." "Fine, go to it." "Commandant, may I go there right away?" "Certainly not. You'll wait until the colonel asks for you." 3 days later, an orderly handed me a note, upon which I read, "Corporal Barthas will be presented to me when I visit the encampment at La Motte-Bulleur." In fact, the colonel, who was based at Le Titre, did pass through the encampment a short while later, but he didn't have me summoned. Hey, what was going on? Simply this. The commandant and the captain, fearing troubles for themselves on account of my appeal, could find nothing better to do than to intercept my request, and the colonel's reply was a fabrication to make me wait patiently, and then to lose patience, to put me off through failure. What can you call the conduct of these two stripers? Counterfeiters, liars, cowards? Decidedly, I said to myself, it was easier to obtain an audience with the Sun King Louis XIV in the olden days than it was today to approach a simple colonel. Seeing, or rather not seeing, anything happening, I decided to write directly to this Olympian personage, in spite of the rigorous rules which applied to those who didn't strictly follow the sacrosanct hierarchical channels. I made sure to mention that I was going outside the prescribed procedures, because I hadn't been able to reach him through the regular ways. Things now moved quickly. That very evening, Lieutenant Breton, commanding the 15th Company, had me summoned and told me that he was being asked to present me himself to the colonel the next morning. The next day, April 10th, I made my way to Le Titre. After an hour's wait in the courtyard of the chateau which sheltered the colonel, Lieutenant Breton and I were brought inside. Vestibules, corridors, staircases, everything shined with fresh wax and polish. There were carpets everywhere. Orderlies, batmen, chambermaids, all looked at me in a way which signified, "Where is this filthy poilu going?" Muddy, too, with my clodhoppers leaving a nasty imprint on the parquet floors and the carpets. Finally, they opened a door for us. We entered a room where Colonel Douce, alone, leaning against the marble mantelpiece, received us like a judge receives an accused man. After an inquiring look at my humble person, he said to me in a rough voice, "What are you asking for?" I told my complaints against the punishment which had been inflicted upon me, and I handed him my written appeal, which he read in full. When he finished reading it, he was silent for a moment. "Nevertheless," he said, "according to your commandant and your captain, you're a pretty lousy soldier. Colonel, sir, I have no punishments on my record, neither during the 3 years of my military service, nor during the current campaign. And as I have spelled out in that paper, I've done my duty in every situation, and I can, if you want, give you statements from irrefutable eyewitnesses. If I refused an order that Captain Cross gave me, the whole company will attest that it would have exposed the men to certain death, uselessly, by making them work in daylight in a trench enfiladed by enemy machine guns." "But then," said the colonel in a softer voice, "how do you explain the bad marks in your record?" "Colonel, sir, I can't say, but it might be helpful to know that Captain Cross has some friends in my village who are political adversaries of mine." "Fine, you're dismissed. Lieutenant, stay here." And these two personages discussed the fate of my 2 humble corporal's stripes. That afternoon, in a large fallow field, our company was conducting an exercise. At the far end of my section, deployed as skirmishers, I was crouching with my comrades in the high grass when we spotted, riding toward us, 2 horsemen whom we recognized as the colonel and our commandant, Quinze Grams. The latter looked quite exhausted and worn out. He normally seemed to have all the difficulty in the world staying balanced on his horse, but today it was truly laughable. He was making the most comical efforts to cling to his nag, which was having trouble keeping up with the colonel's mount. One would have said it was Sancho Panza trying to follow his master, Don Quixote. The 2 cavaliers turned toward us, and we could see from the liveliness of their gestures and the sounds of their voices that a spirited discussion was underway. They came right past us without seeing us, and we could hear their words clearly, proving that I was the topic of their conversation. It was the commandant who was saying in his nasal voice, "You know, Colonel, sir, this corporal has very extreme socialist ideas." But right then the 2 officers spotted us, and the colonel, quite surprised, changed the subject. This terrain would be good for a battalion to manoeuvre in. The next day I learned from the colonel's aide, who was from Homps and who was killed on Cote Hill, 304 at Verdun a short time afterward, that Commandant Leblanc, Quinze Grams, and Captain Croce, the Kronprinz 6, were harshly lectured by the colonel. What made him the maddest was that they had blocked my requests for a hearing. He ordered them to restore my stripes to me at the next promotion ceremony. That meant little to me, but I was satisfied by the stroke of bad luck which these 2 interesting characters had encountered. That didn't keep Captain Croce from being promoted to Capitaine Adjutant Major. This news brought great rejoicing to the 21st Company. The men were beside themselves with joyous exclamations, in Occitan. "No more Kronprinz! 4 Eyes is gone!" But our own joy turned into consternation throughout the battalion, because now he'd be wielding his petty tyranny over all of us. The useless functions of Capitaine Adjutant Major had been abolished by a superior officer less stupid than the others, but then they were restored by some idiot at headquarters. The next few days, at the daily assembly, it was nothing but prohibitions, orders, punishments, threats. Beforehand we had enjoyed a state of relative liberty at our cantonments. The good times were at an end. In the main hall of the Mairie of La Motte-Bulleur, where once the daily affairs of the village were decided, under the gaze of Marianne, who symbolizes all the freedoms, our new tyrant had established his headquarters, his commandantur. From daybreak he was right there, booted, gloved, girded in his English get-up. His first duty was to pay a visit to the prisoners locked in the firehouse. He counted and recounted them with scrupulous care. Then, with his chronometer in hand, marking the official time, the time of the Paris longitude to which all watches would be set, he went about his tasks, verifying departures, assemblies, work details, units going out on exercises, etc. Each day a whole company, armed with long brooms made of branches so abundant in the nearby Crécy forest, scoured the streets of La Motte with shovels, spades, rakes, wheelbarrows, tumbrils, sweeping, scraping, scouring, until the appointed hour when the work detail was completed. A few dry leaves or an overlooked sardine can would be enough to put him into a furor. Would that there had been a Courteline in our battalion. He would have made Captain Cromerevier into a legendary character like Adjutant Flick. Around noon, during a break in the exercises, he would convoke the small fry of the stripers, the sergeants, and the corporals, and fixing his glasses on a book as thick as the Old Testament, he would interrogate them on the mysteries of military theory. In the evenings he was no less busy. He would sneak up on the sentinels guarding the exits from the village and the police posts. He would burst into the taverns to collar some poilus who might be quenching their thirsts outside of authorized hours, pursuing petty thieves in the billets, sending home those who were walking around in greatcoat and police cap when you were supposed to be wearing jacket and helmet and hood, or even not supposed to be out at all, because there were set times of day for these get-ups, and patrols of non-coms made the rounds to enforce these rules. This was becoming idiotic. Here is how the heroes, the saviours of civilization, the defenders of the right and the good, etc., are being led. It was a return to the dark past, the age of feudalism, of ancient slavery. On April 8th, a big manoeuvre took place on the Crécy battlefield. I don't know if they wanted to recreate the to and fros of the medieval battle, but we spent all day tangled up in the forest, tramping through dense thickets, our faces lashed by branches and our legs scratched by brambles. At a crossroads I witnessed an altercation between Captain Cromerevier and Lieutenant Cordier, commander of the 14th Company. I caught these words on the fly. Captain, I gave you this order. Cordier. No, you didn't. You're lying. Captain. Watch your language. Cordier. What? Watch my language? Watch how I knock your glasses off your nose. Captain Cross was particularly fond of his glasses, and even fonder of the nose which held them on his face, because he quickly sped off on horseback, to the great joy of all who were watching. On April 15th, after the morning meal, the regiment took the road to Noyelles-sur-Mer to embark on railway cars for a destination officially unknown, but everyone had the sense that we were going to Verdun, where the gigantic battle continued without interruption. Therefore you heard no singing along the 10-kilometre route which took us to Noyelles. Nevertheless, some of us clung to the vague hope that we were going to rejoin our corps in the Oise. Others said they had tips that we would take up a sector in Champagne. At 7 that evening, with 40 piled into each of the cattle cars, and with no straw or benches, the train took us away. Even the colonel didn't know where, stacked one on top of another, without even being able to stretch out our legs, which accordingly cramped up. We spent a very bad night indeed. At 7 in the morning we passed through Le Bourget. At noon we were at Cézanne in Champagne, and we still kept heading east. At 4 in the afternoon, the train entered the station at Vitry-le-François. At this point, we still didn't know our destination, but we would soon find out. If the train took the direction of Châlons, we'd be going to Champagne, which was very calm at that moment. If we continued on toward the east, there could be no more doubt. We were going to Verdun. Alas, that's exactly where we were headed, and at nightfall we disembarked at the station in Revigny. Revigny was a pretty little town, now half destroyed. 3 months earlier, a Zeppelin had been shot down there. No doubt to stretch our legs after 24 hours of immobility, they sent us off to encamp 12 kilometres from Revigny. It was a moonless night, but starry, and the North Star told us that we were turning our backs on Verdun. What did that mean? Besides, we were a good distance from the front lines, because the breeze brought us only the very slightest grumbling from far away, where the horizon sometimes lit up with imprecise flashes of lightning. While passing through one village, a brief order ran along the column. "Attention, the General!" In the village square, beside his automobile, General P watched the regiment parading by. When I passed near him, he called out as he stomped his foot, "But these men are sleeping! Will you look at that?" The General was right. All the men were dozing off. But he was wrong to reproach us, because he had travelled first class, then in an automobile, while we, jumbled together like a herd of animals, were obliged to pace off the kilometres heavily weighted down. We arrived around midnight in a little village where my section was billeted in a shed with half-demolished walls. For bedding, some scraps of straw and hay, of a very doubtful cleanliness. We arrived just in time, because the rain soon started to fall, forcing me to change places 3 times to escape the bothersome drain spouts. The next day it kept right on raining. I read the name on the signpost at the village entrance, Villers-le-Sec, Marne. It should have been called Villers-le-Mouilly. The next day, April 17th, we rested, because the day after we had to begin our approach to Verdun. The Germans had occupied Villers-le-Sec for a few days, but according to the inhabitants they weren't guilty of any serious depredations. The farmer's wife with whom I was billeted was still complaining that a Uhlan had threatened her with his revolver. He had discovered some chocolate, sugar and other delicacies hidden under the good woman's bed, and he wanted to confiscate them, but she protested so energetically that this Uhlan, who in truth was not very ferocious, did not press the matter further. I know Frenchmen who, if they'd been in Germany and in a similar situation, would have had fewer scruples and would have taken possession of the chocolate from under the bed without any hesitation, and of the woman too, as part of the deal, if she'd been young and pretty. At the corner of a little square, while walking around, I saw a crowd gathering and ran over. At first I could see nothing very unusual. They had formed a circle around a brownish, greasy mass, containing what were clearly pieces of bone. What then was this? Someone explained to me that in August 1914, after the terrible struggles which took place in this region, the Germans, masters of the battlefield, gathered up all the dead, their own and ours, and made an immense funeral pyre which they doused with gasoline and lit. For several days the wind carried the hideous odour of grilled flesh for miles around. No one knew how, but this shape which I had before my eyes was a piece of what remained when the sinister bonfire burned out. On April 18th, at 8 in the morning, we left Villers-le-Sec. As if to mock us, the rain fell in a heavy downpour. Each of us protected himself as best he could. Most had English raincoats, which the Tommies had sold or traded us. Others improvised hoods with tent cloths. All of a sudden I thought I heard wrong. They passed down the order to remove our raincoats, right at the moment when the rain was heaviest. This stupid order came right from our famous Capitaine Adjutant Major, the Kronprinz. He was no doubt recalling, with perfect timing, that a circular had gone around a few days ago, prohibiting the wearing of raincoats which weren't the colour blue, the only one allowed, no doubt at the instigation of a supplier. Captain Croix-Merivier wouldn't have given it a second thought, without the idea of avenging himself for the affront that Lieutenant Cordier, commanding the 22nd Company, had given him in the forest of Crécy. I've already said that Lieutenant Cordier had equipped all the men in the company in khaki-coloured raincoats. Preventing us from using these raincoats made this act of generosity completely useless, and enraged Lieutenant Cordier, whose principal and perhaps only fault was being too quick-witted. That was reason enough for the Kronprinz. Letting 1,000 men get soaking wet was secondary for him. Himself, wrapped in a sky-blue foul-weather cape, he rode alongside the flank of the column, pitilessly ordering the removal of the offending raincoats. Those who had put their packs, canteens, haversacks and other gear on top of the raincoats were obliged to halt and fall behind a kilometre or so while they arranged their attire. At noon we arrived, still in the rain, at the village of Noyer-Hauscourt, in the Meuse, where the regiment would be billeted. This village was filled with rear echelon slackers who had been ensconced there for more than a year. There were hundreds of them, Signalmen who were guarding a substantial amount of communications gear, destined to be installed in conquered territory. You could see stacks of telephone and telegraph poles, piles of porcelain fixtures, and rolls of enough wire to link Paris to Berlin once we got there. While waiting for that, the main task of the slackers was to go fishing in the river, to pass time carving on artillery shell caps, and to flirt with the ladies of Noyers. Our untimely arrival troubled the peace of these pacifistic soldiers, and we had a tough time finding something with which to shelter ourselves, so we had to wait in the rain for someone to make room for us. My section was lodged in the attic of a tumbling-down old house, inhabited by poor folks, a woman with 5 or 6 children, not counting the 3 others who were out in front, defending this dump. The floorboards where 30 of us were lodged were half rotted away, and we feared that at any moment we'd all go crashing down onto the ground floor. We didn't get any straw, and I was considered a lucky stiff by my comrades for having found in a nook an armful of dried pea plants to stick under my backside. In 1914, a skirmish had taken place in Noyer. The church was grazed by a shell, and in the adjacent cemetery a few soldiers, both French and German, rested fraternally partnered in death. The day after our arrival we rested. We expected to depart at any minute, but no order came down, that day or the next day. That afternoon, despite stormy weather, they sent us out to do field exercises. But Noyers is surrounded by prairies which the recent rains had transformed into swamps. We covered several kilometres without finding suitable ground for manoeuvring with dry feet. We almost got lucky enough to escape this need for exercise, but nevertheless ended up finding a bit of ground less soggy than the others, and the exercise took place, despite the water which sometimes submerged our shoes. Meanwhile, the clouds piled up in a worrisome way, and thunder was heard, but this had no effect on the lieutenant who was commanding us, and who waited for the first raindrops to fall before ordering our return to camp. The result? A complete soaking, with the bonus of a lashing, stinging sleet, all very disagreeable. Soaked through to the bone, we reached the first houses of Noyer, savouring the thought of dry underwear and shirts on our skins, when we saw our old acquaintance Captain Croix-Merivier, the Kronprinz, running toward us, waving his arms for us to stop. What did he want, this animal? His timing was perfect. A murmur, or rather a groan, ran through the ranks. As if he were announcing sensational news, the captain explained to our lieutenant that Army Headquarters, after what were no doubt laborious studies, had decided that henceforth we could march in columns of 3s, instead of only in 4s, 2s, or single file, as military theory had previously set forth. All that had been missing was 3s, and this highly regrettable omission was now rectified. Our enthusiastic Captain Adjutant Major couldn't wait to try it out on the first unit which fell into his hands. Cursing under our breaths, we did a left face, then counted out 1, 2, 3, then the lieutenant commanded, "To the right by 3s, march!" The movement, with childlike simplicity, was executed perfectly. The captain, dumbfounded and beaming, asked our lieutenant to repeat this manoeuvre frequently and to get us used to marching in 3s. Then he left us to return home in peace. On April 25th, we carried out a marching exercise during which we went through the village of Somme, entirely burned down and razed. All that was left was the blackened carcass of the church. The newspapers had told how in 1914 the Germans, exasperated by the fierce resistance offered by a tiny rearguard unit, avenged themselves atrociously on this village, which they pillaged and burned, and on its inhabitants. It was said that people were shot, children were raped and killed, women's breasts were cut off. But I have to say that of the inhabitants of the region whom I questioned about these matters, none could give me precise information. On the ruins of the houses they had built cosy little wooden habitations, painted in bright colours, garlanded with climbing flowers, all in an unexpected, charming and picturesque appearance. In these devastated places, where I expected to find only lugubrious silence, I heard the song of a young girl, the laughter of a child, a dog barking, a cow mooing. Somme was arising from its own ashes.